the quarterfinals of the IIUM. On the motion, this House believes that states should not seek to repatriate historical artifacts. We invite the Prime Minister to start.
Ladies and gentlemen, when the Queen in her Jubilee came out, and for all the worlds to see, and the Kohinoor came out, an Indian crown jewel that the Indians, that the British took during the war, that the British, it was a trophy of the British victory in India came out. A big discussion happened as to whether or not this should be repatriated to India or should be kept with England. And the British were saying, no, we should not give this away because we help India so much in so many different areas. And Indians were saying, oh no, this is nationalist, we need to cut them off, and we don't want this, we want this artifact to be returned. Now, our stance is clear on this side, because what we want to say is that former colonizers, strong powers, should hold on to their artifacts because it helps them foster relationships with their previous colonizing countries. And on the other hand, the previously colonized countries, it gives them tangible benefits because of it. And therefore, we should not repatriate artifacts back to the original countries. What am I going to bring to you today? First of all, I want to talk about the right to hold on property. Secondly, I'm going to talk about constructive repatriatism. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the rise of radical nationalism. First of all, the right to hold on property. First of all, these artifacts are obviously historical in context. They were trophies of victory. They were not stolen or anything. They were trophies of victory captured during times of war, during the time that, based on the rules of that time, the rules of war during that time. That was the status quo at that time. So on a very basic principle level, they have the right to hold on to that property. Second of all, let's talk about this major issue of constructive repatriatism. What do we see after the British colonized India? Well, ever since then, we see that they've, not just India, but all these Commonwealth nations, the British feel like they have an obligation to their Commonwealth nations. And this is not something that is merely just altruistic of them. They're just like, yeah, we just merely feel guilty. No, it's because they also are reminded of their history when they see the Kohinoor, and they feel guilty when they feel when they reminded of the horrors, and that's what actually has helped create so much help. I mean, the Malaysian education system is British. Okay, let's face it. Because why? Because the British knew that they had some involvement, they had some interference in Malaysia, and this is part of what helps foster good relations between UK and Malaysia. But what we want to say is that, like, what we say is that repatriating an artifact doesn't actually help the country that receives it at all. As opposed to keeping it in England has translated into policy help, assistance in many different ways, whether educationally, militarily, in many other ways. But on the other hand, if you take this away from them, it leads to these kinds of things like the UKIP party in England, which are waiting to say, oh, you are taking our history, therefore we don't want to be part of you anymore. We don't want to have bilateral relations, as strong bilateral relations. Right. Because they have no due cause anymore. Because right now they still have a due cause to help you, because there's this, it fosters cooperation. For example, in India, when homosexuals were being harassed, who was the first person to speak up? It was Britain that was the first person to speak up. Why? Because they still have this cohesive relationship. Why? Because they still, this artifact is just part and parcel of this history that links them together. Sure. It says you have a relationship with us, and therefore we need to speak up for you. But if there's no link between these two countries, then there's no real incentive for England to ever speak up, or any other countries to speak up when problems occur with India. So let me move on to my second point: is what are the harms of not repatriating constructively? On the first point, I'm talking about extremism. We have parties in India that, like the Shiv Sena, right? They're not necessarily, their main modus operandi is not taking the Kohinoor back, but they have bad beef with England, and they want to isolate themselves from it. They want to not depend on the British at all, not even take any assistance for them. Now, what happens at the point that you repatriate the artifact? Now they have a symbol to look up to. Now they see, hey, we have the Kohinoor back. We don't need Britain anymore. There's nothing that even links us anymore. we can do this on our own, and that is dangerous because in this globalized world, we do need this interdependence. We don't need rise of radical nationalism spreading throughout. And okay, before I move on to the other harms,
I can empathize that it's difficult to prove the burden on side government. But seriously, you're telling me that Commonwealth countries continuously have business or policy-making deals with Britain because Britain holds its artifacts together.
it is a reminder of the history. That is the very main point, because at the point at which you don't have anything necessarily from historically to show that you did actually colonize them before, at that point, what incentive do you have? You just have normal incentive. But here, at least you have a historical imperative, because England is not just about modern day. We still have all the Queen still exists. So I mean, clearly, history is very important to that country, and without that incentive, that impetus to actually help India at the scale they do would not exist. Number two, besides extremism, what are the other problems? The other problem is a lot of these countries, whether actively or have the ability to deny or change their history. The point you give the Kohinoor back to India, what's stopping the Chief Senate to say, okay, you know what? One generation from now, they won't even know it was taken to England. At that point, they don't know their own country's failures. How are they supposed to overcome the obstacles that India faces today if they don't know their history? As you know, history always repeats itself. But if you don't know the history, then you're definitely doomed to repeat it. And we think this is obviously harmful because what do we see? Well, okay, why was India was able to be conquered by British in the first place? Because there was problems with corruption by the ruling monarchs. There was problems with tribalism. These still exist today. I know it's 2014, but we still have ethnic, religious, problems in India. Secondly, thirdly, about the safety of historical artifacts. Right now, these artifacts are in the best guardians, but in a lot of these countries, because of the rise in nationalism and all of these things, we see, like, okay, for example, Muslims in Gujarat are still marginalized. Now, if you give a country like this historical artifacts that remind them of things they don't like and they're radical, how do we can ensure the safety of these historical artifacts? How do you know that the history won't be changed or this artifact will not be thing? Because it doesn't actually. Historical artifacts are for the whole of humanity. They're not just for that country. They're for everyone to see. And so their safety is very important. And lastly, we've already made reparations in the form of, like I said, tangible assistance to these countries. So we feel like on a principle level, reparations are already made. This is constructive reparations because these former colonized countries are getting tangible benefits instead of just merely receiving a symbolic token of their history. They're getting tangible benefits because of that strong link that they still have, because they're reminded of their history, not because they simply are just being nice people to the Indians. And for all these reasons, we feel that constructive repatriatism is the way to go, and that artifacts are actually that catalyst that help you foster that cooperation that you need for former colonized countries to help their former colonies. With that, I proudly conclude.
Thank you, Prime Minister. To begin side opposition's case, we invite the leader of opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that artifacts hold a very sentimental value to the people on the grounds, especially when you own a particular artifacts of that artifacts of that country, right? But before I move on to my substantives, what is the burden coming from side opening opposition? Our burden is to prove to you that it will benefit to the people of the country who owns that artifact, right? But before I move on to my substantives, let's take a look at what opening government have already stated in today's debate. Firstly, they told us that these people have rights to have property, right? For instance, the crown jewel. But essentially, we believe that it is mutually exclusive under your side only, because crown jewel is owned by the UK, and yeah, sure, that you also share a sentimental, historical value to India, but essentially it then still belongs to the UK at the end of the day, because it is not yours to keep. Because they told us this will then suddenly foster cooperation. We don't think so, because there's a lot more any other avenue that you can foster cooperations, not just by through artifacts, because we believe that artifacts hold a very sentimental value to the state at the end of the day. It will benefit the people, and we hold very dear, it is something that people hold very dear and closely to them, right? But no thank you. Secondly, they told us myriad levels of harms, but essentially it boils down to only two. Firstly, they want to talk about how it will incite extremism upon the people, and secondly, how people share this historical artifacts, and somehow they should keep it, right? Firstly, on this idea of extremism, they told us that how people will then be radicalized because people feel they'll be independent from this country, right? But we believe that when you keep this artifacts, it will then become a trophy. We believe that it becomes a symbol as a trophy over the dominance of the other country. We believe this is extremely abhorrent because that country owns that very artifact in the first place. But secondly, they told us how we should keep it because we share this artifacts, and yeah. So, but we believe that it is for others to see. But we believe that you can visit that very country and go to that country and look at their artifacts. We believe that people have extensive and more nuanced history when you go to that country because they actually did historical backgrounds and whatnot, right? Done with my rebuttals. Now I'll move on to my substantives. No, thank you. Sit down. Firstly, we tell our burden is to prove to you how it will benefit the people on the grounds, right? People of the country who actually owns the artifact. Our first level of analysis is that we believe that it will preserve the nature of the artifact. What do we mean by nature of this artifact? The reason why it is made, and secondly, why is it there? I have two levels of analysis that I will provide to you in today's debate. Firstly, we will prove to you how firstly, we tell you how there's an understanding of the artifact itself, right? Because we believe that an artifact has a historical value on its own, right? Since it is preserved and we got it from our ancestors, we understand the significance of that very artifact. The people on the ground want to know the background of that very artifact. We believe that people will understand better if you know our status in the world because of the contribution made by our ancestors, right? Then this will benefit two people, which is the people on the ground and also historians wants to make research on that very artifacts or that very country in the very first place. But before that, yes.
Yeah, are you saying it's exclusive that you can only understand a historical artifact if it's in the country of?
No, but we believe. No, thank you. Sit down. No, but we believe that when the artifact is put into that very country, people on the grounds who actually share their experience of their artifact, our ancestors who share the experience. When people did extensive research on that very artifact, we believe that the nuance of that history is much more elaborate and much more rich in that country, as opposed to you moving that artifacts from another country to another country. You only have like lesser or less extensive research, right? But yeah, we believe that it benefits two people here, which is the society and also the historians, because we believe that the locals can see and understand better of their background, because we believe that it is part of their identity and they can nuance and extend more of that history of that very artifact. But secondly, we believe that historians, no thank you, can understand the history better on that very country that I've answered through the POI coming from opening government, right? Because we believe that when the artifact is put into the very country, there are more extensive facts done because of the research done also by the people who experience on that value of artifact, right? No, thank you. My second level of analysis through my first substantives, and we believe that it will magnify the importance of that artifact, because we believe on the status quo, people right now, we value history lesser. When you move artifacts from other places to other places, the artifacts lose its significance to other people of the land. So because you own that artifact, and when you keep that artifact, it magnifies the importance of the very importance of the history and also the artifact itself. Then people will then on the ground will understand more the value of that artifact better, right? For instance, the Batu Bersurat, or also the written stone in Terengganu. Like people in other places or other countries will not understand the machinery of this Batu Bersurat. But when you put that on the grounds on Malaysia itself, people will understand this better and will tell you and regale you the history of how this is established, and also how the lineage of the country, and also how you run the country in that particular instance, right? But before 6, better behind.
Ma'am, your benefit is not exclusive. If you're worried about individuals don't understand about history, we're willing to subsidize all these kinds of history so that individuals on the ground to understand.
We believe that, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that artifacts hold a very sentimental value to the people and also to the state, because the state owns that very artifact. It is much more better and better for the understanding of the people on the grounds, because it is put there and people have already shared some sort of history and also value to that very artifact, right? Because they wanted to enforce this value of people understanding history, but we think it is better under our side of the house, right? But we believe that artifacts, for instance, Candi Borobudur, that have already been demolished by Malaysian government. There's a lot of protests being done by the people on the ground, because we believe that the significance of this artifact holds very closely to our heart, right? But second level of substantives is that it will help us to trace our lineage, because we believe that artifacts hold a very sentimental value to the state, but as well to the people, for the betterment of the people on the grounds, because we believe that it is part of our identity. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that artifacts owned by that state should stay in that state, because people have the right, and also the state have the right to that very artifacts. It holds a very sentimental value to us. Ladies and gentlemen, go with Opo.
Thank you, the proposition. Next, we invite the artifacts.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, first thing I'm going to do is reevaluate the nature of existence in the ground. Second thing that I'm going to do is engage with all the points that came from this side. A third thing I'm going to do is whatever Rayan told you, I'm going to give you extensions to all those in terms of more illustrations. And the fourth thing I'm going to do is bring the final substantiated from our side, which is safety of the artifacts themselves. Now, moving on into the speech. Firstly, on the point of right to hold on, right now they haven't engaged with that at all. These were legitimate victories, and right now we have legitimate owners, right? Let's look at these artifacts themselves. Kohinoor itself is so debated, right? Kohinoor did not belong to one entity before it went to British. In fact, Kohinoor has been reshaped and changed throughout ages. Before the British, it belonged to the Mughal. Before the Mughal, it belonged to the India. Before the Mughal, it belonged to the Indian rulers. And before the Indian rulers, God knows who it belonged to, right? So that's the thing. The existence of these artifacts itself are so debatable. And this is the nature. The final victorious party gets to keep these artifacts, and that incentivizes them to remind themselves, hey, you know what, we won over them, but we still have some sort of responsibility. In 21st century, that translates into pragmatic repatriation, the concept that Rayan has clearly explained to you. Therefore, they don't tell us why the artifacts are, why the sanctity of the artifacts should take any precedence over the pragmatic side, right? Even they have considered their burden to prove why people are going to gain any benefit. Therefore, we still expect some engagement in terms of why they should not legitimately own these artifacts? Did they not legitimately win over them? And even if you consider the history of artifacts like Kohinoor, did anyone, according to your characterization, did anyone ever legitimately have it, right? Therefore, it should be the victorious who gets the spoils, right? That's how it goes. Now, the second problem that we have come across is when they did not engage with all the constructive things that actually happens in these countries. So you go continent, some of the best universities like Dhaka University in Bangladesh, or in India, Kolkata University, Delhi University, these were infrastructures, universities and systems built by British. The legal code in these countries were all adopted from the colonizers. In India, we used to burn our woman when the husband died. We stopped doing that when the British made us stop doing that. These are the sort of constructive changes that came into our country. So no, British are not evil. They actually changed us for good. And this is the one thing in 21st century that they can still hold on to. Therefore, Commonwealth is not just a farce. It translates into millions of dollars of aid, especially when you go into Bangladesh, especially when you go into African countries. You look at France and Congo. Congo would die without the French giving them aid. And these are the sort of tangible benefits that they still achieve. So so once in a while, Congo still says, hey, you know what? We need our artifacts back. And we still say, hey, you know what? We need our artifacts back. But you know what? They have it and they own it legitimately. And that is what gives us the leverage to ask for all those repatriations, for all the harms done for conquering us in the past. So those are the pragmatic sides we still expect them to engage, right? It's still a matter of mutual benefit. But then again, the relationship is so disproportionate, right? The aid is so disproportionate, right? The only reason is because there is a history associated with it. But the third thing that we need to take care of is when you go to the ground, right? So we have goldfish memory. The problem that allowed the British to take us over still persists, right? Therefore, you go into Gujarat and there are high-end streets. The moment the high-end street ends is the moment, is the place where Muslims start living. These are the practical realities in Gujarat. Shiv Sena is associated with the biggest incidences of violence in the past 2 decades. These are the practical realities on the ground. These inconsistencies still exist. Families still continue to rule us, right? Therefore, as Rayan told you, the moment the Queen brought out the Kohinoor during Jubilee, all the activists and NGOs started saying, hey, you know what, you care so much for the Kohinoor, but do you actually care about your country? These are the sort of pragmatic criticism that only happens when you react to how you feel, right? That visceral reaction you have when you realize that, hey, you know what, we lost something we cared about, but that in turn gives rise to something good. That in rise gives turn to constructive discussions, right? But these are the things they have completely evaded. We still expect answers for these things. How do you expect to have these visceral reactions and intensive discussions without actually accepting your history, right? You have to accept your history. Therefore, historical revisionism should be out of the question. They haven't told us the benefits of historical revisionism, right? Therefore, we tell you, you go into these countries, some of the best people actually migrated away to these previous colonizers and they came back to their country and developed them. Tell me how the previous colonizers will still have incentives, especially when Rayan told you about UKIP and how these conservative parties are becoming more and more powerful and are calling for reduced amount of aid, right? Now, moving on to the point of safety, we have already before that,
so just like if you tell me artifacts, we don't know the history and origins. Certain islands and certain past colonial lands have been directly dominated, but like Hong Kong was given back, and if these things are really in dispute, why not find a neutral arbiter to kill it?
So that's the thing, right? Every artifact is going to have so different chain of history, right? So therefore, instead of going to that discussion, what's better is when someone owns the artifact right now, for example, British own the Kohinoor, you can still appeal to them, and that's what is happening. And the more pragmatic problem is the rise of political extremism, which is going to enable parties like UKIP to say, we don't even have any trophies of victory anymore, so we shouldn't even care. Moving on to the point of safety, first thing we need to understand is these are world heritage. These artifacts no longer belong to one nation. Therefore, we disagree with their characterization. Kohinoor does not belong to the Indians anymore. It's a part of global heritage. It belongs to everyone. It belongs to the existence of human beings. Therefore, you also need to look into the amount of cost that goes into preserving these artifacts. Now, they have conceded to how countries like even Malaysia, Bangladesh, India routinely destroy our sites of world heritage. You go to Bangladesh and Panam city, which is the oldest city, we have demolished it to the ground. You go to India and you will find the same instances. The truth is, the previously colonized country, we still don't care about our artifacts. So you need to tell us why we will suddenly start caring the moment we get Kohinoor back, right? So the pragmatic solution is to keep it with people who actually keep it safe. Therefore, they still haven't shown us why these countries have shown any change in terms of trends that they follow or trends that they subscribe to, right? So we see, you go back to ground, we are still destroying our sites of heritage. So we have no incentive to actually take care of our artifacts. We are greedy people who want everything, who cannot keep anything safe. But that's not the sort of thing we should enable. Now moving on, right? So we have seen under both sides, we need to take care of people, but who has given you the best degree of tangible benefits? Which team has shown you how the existence of artifacts in a certain geographical location enables the previously colonized nation to appeal for aid and all those practical things? Therefore, for the sake of artifacts, for the sake of the safety of artifacts, and for the sake of not indulging in historical revisionism and for people, we should not give this back. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We invite the Deputy Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what is he basically saying right now? That is, I bash his head with a wood, but then I help him afterwards. I can take the trophy just because I helped him. Because let's talk about the reality here. What he wants is that the artifact to become a trophy over the dominance of a country. We think that's the most abhorrent thing that a person can do. They didn't help them. They come there, they conquer the country, they take away all the rights of the people, and now they want a trophy, a gift for that, and we do not accept that. Because when you talk about colonization, we are talking about abuse of the people. We are talking about British using them as slaves to follow them, to follow their will. And now when you take the artifact, you keep the artifact, you are telling these people that basically you are still under our influence because you are too weak to keep your rights inside your own country. Because we think that after you decolonize from this country, the least that you can do is to return their dignity to them, to show them who they was before the colonization, and to tell them that yes, you can have your rights again because we have detached ourselves from you. But under their side, they want to keep all these abuses as a trophy, and we think it's abhorrent because the first speaker conceded to the fact that there is no benefit to the recipients, but there is 1,000 benefits for those who are in the local country, because it holds no significance to foreigners, because it is very detached from their own history. They do not understand Batu Besurat, they do not understand the crown jewels of India. Only the locals can understand that because they are attached and they have sentimental values with the purpose of the artifact. Sit down. So now, what are the harms here? The harms here become that there will never be an intensive discourse or discussion, because now the history of these people becomes secondary to the history of the foreigner. Why? Because there will always be prioritization of history. So what the history of the local will become secondary. It will become something that we only talk about if we have nothing else to talk about. So we think this is harmful. At least when you repatriate these artifacts, it becomes the main prioritization of the country, and that's where you have the intensive discussion that you want. And that is where the clash of culture happens, because people come from outside to your country to learn about your country, and that's where everything happens. So let's talk about Mahirah's argument, where he didn't respond. She talks about the elements and purpose of the artifact, because all these artifacts are made for a purpose, but you cannot understand that if you do not understand the surrounding which causes the artifacts to be made. If there is a Batu Besurat there, where it tells the story about how you run a country, you cannot understand that if you do not know the circumstances of the surrounding of the country that forces the Batu Besurat to be made. And also now, people lose realization of the importance of their lineage, because now the constant reminder of their identity is taken away. So you focus on the modern life, but you do not care about your lineage. So we think this is harmful when people do not remember where they come from. So let's talk about the responsibility, because they try to argue that now these people wouldn't be responsible over other country because they don't have anything to link them back to the country. But we think you help people on the basis of you being a human being. You help people to protect your own benefit, because you have trading with them like British and the India, and you help them because we are removed from the medieval age where we destroy each other. That's the basis of us helping each other, not because we keep some stone from your country, we do not think that his argument can stand. And also, we think it's harmful when under their side, they have no patriotism, because we think that when you do not keep the artifact in your country, you are still telling the people on the ground that the state up to that point is still failing you. They couldn't keep your rights at all. And we think that is harmful because you're telling the people that you still need other people to protect what is yours. So we think that especially on countries that are decolonized, governments are always under scrutiny and perceived as weak. At least under our side. Now we tell you that these are the kind of government that protect your rights and we fight for what is ours. So we think at least under our side, people have confidence on their government.
If you think it's so harmful that people aren't going to be able to learn their history, then when a British person wants to learn his history, in the absence of all these artifacts, won't he also suffer?
We keep our artifact. We learn from our own artifact. So we think the British, we can still learn about their own history from their own artifact keep in their own land. You cannot learn about your history if your artifact are taken away to another country. So we think that the POI doesn't stand. So I'm going to talk to you about how this will develop an international understanding on the purpose of the artifact. Because now in the status quo, there is a concentration of information in which you keep all the artifacts in the first world country only because you think that these are the only ones developed and advanced enough to learn about the artifact. So what are the harms here? Firstly, you cannot see the artifacts in its elements. So you have no understanding. You don't see the purpose why the artifact is made. So we think that apart from the foreign historians, other people doesn't care and doesn't understand the artifact. So the problem here is that the artifact loses its importance. It doesn't hold any significance because there is no one to understand the purpose of why it is made. And also the second harm is that states have no incentive to develop anything on historical advancement. And why is this? Because now states are always fit with the narrative that this state is not good enough to conduct studies and researches on the artifacts on the basis that they are not first world country. So they will always have two tendencies. Firstly, they will ship their artifacts off because of the manufactured thought that other states can do better research. And secondly, they will always be compelled by other states to give their artifacts away for better research. So here development becomes slow. Because you do not see the necessity for you to bring up your historical field because there is nobody interested enough to learn about it. So here is where the first world country becomes more developed in history. They learn about the history of other people and they can hardly understand it because it is not in their nature or in their element. But the people in the third country that have just been decolonized, such as under their paradigm, cannot develop their historical field because nobody is interested to learn about it. The state doesn't want to fund doesn't want to fund the historical field. So we think this is harmful because you further detach yourself from your historical value. You lose your rights to identity. You lose the information on what forms the country and the history behind the sufferings that your ancestors suffered. So we think when you lose this rights to identity, you lose what makes your country becomes your country. Because we think the least that a country can have is the behind them, because at least it shows you what you were and what you aspire to be. So we think we need them to keep their artifacts to be the constant reminder of who they are right now, and because of that we oppose.
Thanks for the proposition. To start the second half of this debate, we invite the government.
From closing government, let's deal with their first rebuttal first. Understanding the value of artifacts and only how local people can comprehend this. Firstly, closing government are happy to concede that might exist an inalienable sentimental value to this artifact. However, we don't think that research and the knowledge of the surface level of this artifact is part of this debate, because this is something everybody across the world can understand by simply reading a textbook about it or reading a journal about it. We don't think that it's part of the debate. Even if it is undermined when you move it to other countries were extremely fine with awareness and how, like in places of these artifacts where you put it in places like museums or places where people go to seek out knowledge, and you're always going to be notified about where this artifact comes from, all the historical sentiments surrounding it. We think that the knowledge on an artifact itself is accessible to mostly everyone. You don't have to be from the same proximity to understand all the knowledge about this. You can outsource this knowledge, write journals on it, visit a country, understand it there, and bring it out and make everyone understand it. We don't think that knowledge has a link to the geographical proximity of this artifact. We concede that there might be a sentimental value upon it, but because a lot of the analysis was only predicated around the research and the knowledge of this on a surface level and not the sentimental value of this, we think that this point has fallen. This is why we don't think that research and historians actually developing this is much of a part of this debate. Next, they tell us that artifacts lose significance to local people on the ground when it has been away a long time. Then what's the dire need for you repatriating it to begin with? If you concede that when this artifact has been taken away from you for a very long time and people start even forgetting about its existence and history, then why would you even want to take it back? That means that you lose the very dire need that your first speaker tried to fight so hard for. And this is a contradiction on her case. Once you tell her that people have such a dire need to have it in their country and only then can they understand it, but on the other hand tell us that people forget it the minute it's gone, a contradiction and tension here in their case. Next, they tell us about a trophy of dominance, how this demeans other countries' capabilities in fighting war. Well, this argument is not exclusively against historical artifacts to begin with. It's against all kinds of spoils of war. It's also against you glorifying winning wars in things like textbooks, where you tell your students, we were so happy and proud to win this war against this other country. Are you also principally against that? This argument of trophy of dominance is against all kinds of spoils of war, where we tell people that we openly have won this war before, not against historical artifacts exclusively. No, thank you. But then their final argument, how this creates a stigma of third world countries. We're happy to condemn the characterization of the existence of this mindset. We tell you that people take your historical artifacts in the name of wars or in the name of glorifying your name within the international sphere, not because you want to undermine the third world countries' capabilities to research these artifacts. We just don't understand where this mindset comes from. We don't agree with the existence of it. So three extensions. The first one, why an obligation no longer exists for these countries to give back. We're living in the 21st century where countries are generally at peace, not many conflicts, and have achieved a stage whereby they are stable states and have no much tensions with other countries. We think that any previous conflicts, if you had any, have been settled and these wrongs have been retributed. Why is this? Firstly, it's because we had the Treaty of Atlanta in the 1900s, whereby this treaty mandated that not only colonizers release their colonies, which was a huge source as to why colonizers released their colonies and let them have their own independence, but to give other forms of assistance to these countries as forms of retributions to give them back what they had stolen from them. This is why a lot of countries are in debt, which is why a lot of countries have political, diplomatic ties with other countries. You outsource your resources and funding towards them, you give them a lot of political help. We think that any obligation that we had so far does not exist anymore. Secondly, about UN regulations, about how UN is always the watchdog in things like you giving other resources to other countries. They have passed millions of legislations to predating countries to retribute any stolen belongings through monetary means or things like international aid. No, thank you. And the final reason is because these countries, after colonizing, tend to always give back. For example, the British helped so much in Malaysia's independence in their strife, and we think this was extremely important and a sign of retribution. You don't have to take your historical artifacts back. You have no obligation to do so. No, thank you, sir. Second extension, why we shouldn't endorse a retrospective punishment. OG established very well that the rules of war during that time and that era were different. This means that in that time, the spoils of war was something acceptable. It wasn't inherently wrong for you to obtain this to begin with. This means if you craft the laws now to states taking back these artifacts, the colonies might not have taken it to begin with in the first place. You cannot punish states over something they never knew was punishable to begin with. They never had prior knowledge of this punishment. They never consented to this punishment. This means that you show that it's inconsistent and complicit in still punishing these people. No, thank you. This is why you don't punish drug addicts when drugs were legal and suddenly made illegal. You only start legislation of punishment from the second after the legislation has passed and approved. A retrospective punishment is an unjust one. It never comprehended it's especially when these people never comprehended of prior knowledge that this was even wrong to begin with. It was something acceptable then, it might no longer be acceptable now, but you cannot punish these people over it. And that's the stance coming from CG. They never had any knowledge of this, therefore it might have altered their decisions and might have made them not even do this to begin with. This is why we don't support this punishment. Last one.
That essentially is not the case. I'll tell you later. Can you tell me what is, apart from all the good that the British have done for us, what is the net value benefit of still holding on to those artifacts regardless? That's your
Yeah, all right. That's in my third extension. Why the location has sentimental significance and moving it would dilute the significance, right? History is only thoroughly supported when it's true and constructively progressive. If history shows that the British took the jewel from India, then it should stay in British, because now it's a significant part of the British's history in showing how they managed to achieve this from India. It's a historical success that they have achieved. Wars are an integral part of history and vital to your social understanding of what had happened. But even by OO's own logic, now people in these countries that have newly obtained all these sentimental bonds, have developed sentimental bonds to these artifacts, and it's harmful to their closure if you take it away. Following their own line of logic, their logic also applies to these countries who have newly applied or newly obtained all these kinds of historical artifacts, because that's how artifacts pass. The history behind it is extremely blurred. Therefore, by their logic, that any country who achieves it, then the next country who achieves it gets the exact same benefits and the exact same harms if you take these artifacts away. For example, like many Malaysian artifacts fall to the British's hands, now it's their artifacts. And they always have notes telling it that, oh, like we achieved this because we took over Malaysia at one point. This doesn't mean that we demean them in any way. We instead glorify them and we don't dilute the history of these artifacts. This means that people in the newly obtained countries have a sentimental significance and bond to these newly acquired things, and we do not demean the countries that we took them from. This is the stance coming from CG. We're so happy to propose.
Thank you, Government Member. We next invite the opposition member for a speech.
It's not spoils of war. Wars happen legitimately between two governments. We're talking about colonization. When the British came and colonized Malaysia and Singapore, that wasn't a war, that was blatant colonization. There's a stark difference between what Tariq wants to talk about and what the entire other debate is talking about. Let's look at the CG. They say the dominance is legit because it's the spoils of war. Unfortunately, in today's world, Tariq, we teach them otherwise. We teach our people to be respectful of the rights and liberties of everyone else. So no, the dominance that we teach today isn't legitimate in the current moral compass that we talk about. Therefore, there's a moral obligation to return them. Then they tell us there's no need. We've given them enough. We've given the people we've colonized enough in return. But that's not the debate. Regardless or irrespective of how much good you've done, you need to show me that there's a net value in still keeping those historical artifacts. And the only thing they've proven inside government is that it's a symbol of dominance. Unfortunately, the literature and the texts that we teach our children today shows us that the dominance was illegitimate, that the dominance shouldn't have existed to begin with. Then they told us it's retrospective punishment because it wasn't illegal back then. Sit. But yes, it's legal, it's illegal now. And given the moral compass that you've implored now onto your societies, you recognize the kinds of wrongs that have been done. And given that recognition, why isn't that moral compass then used to adjudicate on what you should do and what you shouldn't do, given that you still hold those artifacts? So the historical precedences of what the moral compass was back then is diluted in the closing government's model. But lastly, they told us this was historical success because it's a symbol that we've won. Let's look at the reasons why they came in the first place. They came to use up our natural resources. They came to spread religion. These are all things that wasn't a part of a war where we tried to defend ourselves. They colonized us because they were far more superior. So of course it's implied victory when you intend to dominate someone that's far more inferior to begin with. So if you call it a success, that's your perspective. I will continuously disagree.
Opening government was even more hilarious. They told us, we've brought a lot of good, but unfortunately, these are forced trade-offs. You can't force dominance on someone and then say, we'll take this back in terms of gratitude, because that gratitude is not mutual to begin with. Secondly, they told us, policy making is better because it creates better diplomacy from a military and economic perspective. No. There's a mutual understanding the countries now have because we're dependent on trade and we're interdependent with each other. It's got nothing to do with your museums. Then they told us, we can't teach history without these things. I actually wrote this here, lol. Secondly, history is far better documented with or without your artifacts, so we can still teach history under these instances. But secondly, they told us, we don't know the real owners, and because it's an arbitrary line, therefore we can't decide. But if it's arbitrary, why do you have this sense of entitlement of ownership and instead allowing, arbitrary bodies like UNESCO to decide the real heritage or the real owners of these kinds of things? There are ways out. Arbitrary ownership is not an excuse. Then they told us there's global heritage. Sit. I really don't know what global heritage means, but the point they were trying to make was, we tend to destroy our own cultures. We tend to destroy our own artifacts. And we have every damn right to do so because we own them. The autonomy that we have in terms of whether we want to destroy or whether we want to keep our autonomy is no excuse for the past colonizers to say, we'll hang on to your heritage because you don't know what to do with them. That's the exact kind of dominance we had 50 to 60 years ago. Say. Got three things to talk about. Number one, why the sense of entitlement must stop, why this repatriation is a countervailing narrative to the colonialism and the sense of dominance that Tariq wants to amplify, and thirdly, why the change in property ownership in general is very different when you look at the kinds of historical artifacts because it's embedded in culture. Say. Firstly, why is there a sense of entitlement and why must it stop? The first thing we heard from the entire government bench is that it's a sense of pride. What we will tell you on opposition, especially in closing, is this is a one-up mentality that reinforces that we were always superior and that we still are. The kind of disparities between the European nations that used to take over Africa still exist, and we will always be superior because we hold on to things that are fundamentally important to you because we can. Those are the kinds of one-up mentalities that we want to retrograde and we think shouldn't exist in today's society. But secondly, we teach people now, and it is a known fact throughout the world, that colonialism was a wrong thing to do, that it was something that should never be repeated, and we teach this in our history books. That's where the fundamental hypocrisy occurs, because in literature and in education, we teach them otherwise, that colonialization, slavery, were wrong because we should have afforded rights and liberties to these people. But keeping those artifacts, you explicitly said it is a victory, it is a sign of success that we've dominated you, just like when Belgium institutionalized slavery in Congo. By you keeping the artifacts that you've taken from Congo and Rwanda, you reinforce the dominance that we were right to institutionalize. Why? Because apparently it wasn't illegal then. But if it's illegal now, the moral judgment call you have to make is to return those artifacts, because you now agree based on the moral compass you have now that it was wrong. That's the hypocrisy that we're not willing to stand for on closing opposition. Go ahead.
In the case where British textbooks glorify winning a war, would you be against this too? Because we have so many sentiments in status quo that says we were victorious over you before.
Yeah, but the context, if Britain were to glorify that they were victorious in a war, we would fundamentally disagree, because it wasn't a war. It was a superior dominance on countries that were far less inferior in terms of military might, in terms of economic capacity. So the Brits can say whatever the hell they want, we still don't care. Secondly, why was this act as a countervailing force to the narrative of colonialism? Sit down. When they came, cultural heritage was stripped off because the narrative was you're primitive, you're archaic, and you're backward. You need to be ashamed because you're far more inferior and you're weak. The intention of the colonizers was to civilize. These artifacts were meant to be unworthy in our possessions. The countervailing force that you have with repatriation is that forced trade-offs are not fair game. We can't impose development that we think is necessary for you, and therefore impose a sense of gratitude when we take away things that are generally beneficial to your culture. These are the kinds of forced trade-offs and forced gratitudes that we think is fundamentally the narrative can't naturally be imposed if you continuously hold on to your artifacts and allow the Queen to continuously glorify them. Lastly, why is the change of property ownership doesn't mean you own these kinds of things. In normal circumstances, perhaps. But the historical artifacts that you're talking about are largely intertwined with culture. The sense of ownership that you feel just because you hold them in your British museums doesn't take away the fact that culturally they're embedded within the people of Africa or within Asia. So the agency that you're talking about is fundamentally lost when a vast majority of people know where this has come from and know who the rightful ownerships belong to. These are the types of nuances, Mr. Speaker, that have been missing throughout the government bench. The sense of dominance that they want to uphold only reinforces the mentality of superiority. But unfortunately, the hypocrisy exists on the ground. When we teach people about rights and liberties, the narrative is so much more different. We need to repatriate.
Thank you, opposition member. And for the last speech from the government side, we invite the government.
The net benefit that we get from site closing government was that the sentimental value of individuals on the ground from that kind of country. Now that's the net benefit that we should keep and we should emphasize on all these kinds of things. Mr. Speaker, the main burden that they tried to prove to us, or there was no any significance that the colonization country and there's no significance of colonization country to actually keep these kinds of artifacts. Secondly, they told us that it's only going to enhance the stereotype where there's only a dominant for example, UK or US as a dominant country. We're going to contest that notion. Firstly, let's move to what side closing opposition said. Firstly, he talked about how colonization is bad. We emphasize now also, or the moral compass that we teach towards individuals on the ground, that colonization is bad. But that still does not negate my speaker's extension. Well, retrospectively, we shouldn't punish colonization. We shouldn't punish colonial countries to even begin with. So by virtue of retrospective, even though it is illegal now, we don't think because back then we don't have information about how colonization is wrong and all those kinds of things. We think by virtue of retrospective, we shouldn't actually punish countries who already done it to begin with. But secondly, even if we should punish them, we think these kinds of historical artifacts, you're really worried about the sentimental values that your society holds upon these historical artifacts. We're willing to subsidize all these kinds of research so that we could recognize that these artifacts also belong to you, so we could recognize that these artifacts belong to your ancestors. We're willing to do that. We don't contest that. But by virtue of geographical proximity, Mr. Speaker, we don't think it cares that much. But we think you cannot negate the same facts around that also there's also sentimental values there's also sentimental values given towards all the societies on the ground, towards other countries also. You cannot negate that fact. But let's move on to the first extension. Sit down. He talked about what happens when you have all these historical artifacts. What happens was that this perception is strong. It's going to enhance that this colonial country is dominant inside inside the world itself. We think we've moved towards a certain perception. We think we've moved towards these kinds of perception. Number one, we are living inside we're living in 21st century, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that this kinds of perceptions still exist. These kinds of historical artifacts, although yes, you have acquired them through colonization, we think it doesn't literally enhance that this country is dominant to begin with. Why? Because firstly, we think we have gone towards all these kinds of trades and we're interdependent with these kinds of first world countries to even begin with. We don't think it creates a harm perceptions towards third world countries because they're interdependent towards first world countries to even begin with. Meaning here that all your trades that you guys wanted to fight for will not be harmed, ladies and gentlemen. It would not happen. It won't actually be harmed. But secondly,
he talked about how it's going to be there's going to be a lot of force trade-off and all those kinds of things. We think firstly, retrospective punishment, like how my extension speaker talked about, applies here. But thirdly, he also talked about this, how the culture from this initial country is going to be harmed. Firstly, we think we're willing to actually subsidize all these kinds of research that you guys are fighting for. If by virtue, if you guys are worried that the culture is going from this initial country is going to be harmed, then we're willing to tell you that this is called historical artifact is acquired from this country, and we're willing to tell you all those kinds of things. There's no problem there. Sit down. Let's go to the side opening. They were more funnier. They said that, hey, what happens when you actually acquire these historical artifacts? This colonial country acquire these historical artifacts. What's going to happen is that you're not going to get research and you're not going to be funded by all these states because they don't have incentive. That was their main burden. They only touched a bit on sentimental value, but my extension speaker already brought it down. Sit down. But secondly, they talked about how the state don't have incentive to actually research towards all these kinds of historical artifacts. Number one, even if the state doesn't have any incentive to actually invest towards these kinds of historical artifacts, we tell you, even inside status quo, there's only research and development, and you have all these NGOs to actually fund your research so that these historical artifacts can be scrutinized to the fullest. But secondly, we think even if that doesn't support your case, that doesn't even support your case to begin with, that doesn't legitimize that you should repatriate these kinds of historical artifacts to even begin with. We think if you're living in the 21st century where all these kinds of perception that doesn't exist as a whole, you shouldn't increase the rhetoric that US or UK, for example, is a dominance party as a whole. These kinds of historical artifacts, don't actually propose all these kinds of perception to even begin with. Yes, sir. Closing.
The only thing running for closing government is that we didn't know it was bad then and we think it's bad now. Would you have agreed then for a white family in the 1960s to continuously keep a slave they've always been having after it was decided that slavery was wrong?
No. We're not okay with that. We agree. This is slavery and colonization is illegal now. We emphasize on that it's very bad also. But retrospectively, it is not legitimate for you to put a punishment by virtue of retrospective because of that, Mr. Speaker. We think all those, we give you a lot of reasons why retrospective punishment does not exist even now in the status quo, because it's unfair. We don't know back then and we know now. And because we know now, that's why it is illegal, Mr. Speaker. So let's talk more about this. Let's talk about what my extension speaker talked about. He talked about why this location does not benefit under our side, what the burden under our side. He talked about why location has sentimental significance and moving it away would dilute the history as a whole. But geographical proximity, Mr. Speaker, because history only thoroughly support, but geographical proximity and the history, you cannot negate the fact that also in times of colonization, these kinds of historical artifacts also is acquired towards the colonial country. By virtue of that, you cannot negate the fact that it also holds some sentimental value towards this kinds of country. So because of that logic, there's also an emotional attachment towards these kinds of historical artifacts. So when you repatriate all these kinds of things, you dilute these kinds of significance that this colonial country holds as a whole. But third of all, what are the harms under their paradigm when you actually repatriate these historical artifacts as a whole? Number one, what you do then under your paradigm is now you create a new stigmatization that this countries such as UK that is now living under 21st century is countries that is dominant. But also we know that they are dominant because of their political and their economic and those kinds of things. But also in third world countries also we are also interdependent because of them. Because in times of colonization also, when British actually colonized Malaysia, Mr. Speaker, British also to a certain extent actually helped Malaysia to actually develop. British taught Indians, British taught Chinese actually how to, plant trees and all those kinds of things to actually develop in terms of economic, Mr. Speaker. For all those reasons, we beg to propose.
Thank you very much. And for the last speech, we invite the opposition.
the British taught us to plant trees. The British gave us schools, they fed us, they gave us aid, even though they stripped it all away from us. They took our obelisk and they put it all around. In London, you would see an obelisk. You would see an obelisk in Paris. It becomes tourist attractions in those countries, right outside Champs-Élysées. They stripped everything away from Egypt, and yet we should be grateful because they're still giving us aid. We tell you that this sort of narrative is abhorrent, and it's something that we don't believe at all should exist. We tell you that holding all of these monuments, if anything, reinforces the sort of colonial pride, and it strips away the sort of pride that previously existed in the countries that were previously colonized as well. Now, what does Tim talk to you about? He talked to you about the sense of entitlement. Why there's a need for you to change post-colonial bravado into something that's post-colonial guilt? Because as much as they talk about how we feel guilty about it, no one actually does a damn thing about it, especially if they're withholding precious diamonds or precious stones away from countries that they previously colonized. But secondly, he also talked to you about the net value of these artifacts and the sentiments that were evoked, ladies and gentlemen. But thirdly, he also looked at the restoration of why there needs to be a restoration of pride and glory that were previously stripped away, because we all recognize the sort of the what's the word? The historical artifacts were not just of physical ownership, but they also have stories and they have multiple layers, and it's complex and a lot of things that already exist. So as much as it changes hands, the story still remains the same, and it still remains constant within this circumstance. And we tell you that that's precisely for that reason it needs to be returned to countries of origin. I'll move on with two arguments. Firstly, who owns the rightful custodian? And secondly, why withholding is unjust. Now, firstly, let's look at this. Who is rightful custodian? Because in this side of the house, they tell you that we lack knowledge of origins, and secondly, it's global heritage. Never mind what global heritage really means. And then they tell you that it's ill-maintained in these countries of origin. So we tell you that lack of knowledge of origins is never justification for you to withhold rights on sole basis of being the victor in this circumstance, especially if you're looking at things like island disputes. When your origins are unknown, you go to the international courts, for instance, as a neutral arbiter to help argue this out. Like we looked at the Spratly Islands in Singapore versus Malaysia, but we had documents to prove origins and it was arbitrated in Singapore. One, we're not happy, but they did because they had arguments to prove so. But secondly, we also looked at it in Hong Kong and how post-colonialism, Hong Kong, despite British having the contract to do so, they had to be rightfully returned at the moment that the contract ends. If we recognize that lands equals the identification of the countries of origins and the right for ownership needs to be restored, why not artifacts, especially when there's a clear symbolic relevance, something that was conceded by the side of the house as well. But secondly, global heritage. What truly is global heritage? But we tell them, why then the colonials get to keep them if they are truly global? What makes colonial the representative of global heritage? But then this is about, when it comes to war, when it comes to colonialism or any form of battle, it involves direct stakeholders. We don't think that exists. But even if it's true, and let's concede that something like global heritage truly exists, we tell you that UNESCO already acts as an incentive already because they recognize truly heritage sites like they did in Bruges, in Belgium, Malacca and Penang, and it boosts preservations as well. So there's a natural incentive also done by the global community with regards to this. But secondly, there's also check and balances already in states at school when you have social backlashes to things when natural monuments or whatever not are being damaged. Yes, but now let's move on to the second idea. Why withholding this is unjust? Because this other house tells you this, that as aid and repatriation is contingent on artifacts, and we need to really, really be grateful for the aid that we receive. Secondly, they tell you if you do take it away, you're retrospectively punishing them. And thirdly, they tell you that these are symbols of success and they need to exist in the countries of the victor. But let's look at this. We have to be very clear that war is different from colonization. Why? Because when you go into colonization, they go in with a true intent, and it's very explicit intent for exploration and investment. And you see that all over the Maritime Museum in Greenwich when they talk about how the Queen sent them out to explore and bring in back heritage and to bring in back richness of other countries, things like spices, because, well, British food is pretty bland in the circumstance. But we tell you that intention was really clear. It's to civilize us, and we go in the pretense to spread religion and to return with the spoils of these countries. They stripped them of natural resources. In Malaysia, we were the largest tin producers. We no longer are when British left. Ladies and gentlemen, they institutionalized blatant racism, inferiority by skin color. The Hutus and Tutsis were explicitly discriminated based on the size of their nose. There's no leadership with regards
to the way that African countries were run. And then when they left, they institutionalized, they instilled democracy on an empty stomach in an area that has never had clear leadership from the locals, ladies and gentlemen, because you removed any form of monarchy in this circumstance. Then they tell you that you have to be gratitude, there has to be gratitude in this circumstance because we instilled democracy, we give you aid, never mind that we stripped you of those resources to begin with. We tell you that gratitude is a false imposition in this circumstance, and time again, this rhetoric of being grateful is unfair and institutionalized the sort of guilt that already exists. Because in efforts to civilize these individuals, they create shames in the lives of the way that society has always lived. They tell you that just because you're African, your religion is primitive, it's barbaric, and you're backwards. And there's sort of shame that already exists when it comes to spreading religion. Before that, yes.
This sort of historical revisionism allows UKIP to be empowered and Shiv Sena to be empowered. How do you possibly engage with them?
That's exactly what we're telling you. This sort of empowerment on the colonizers is unfair because the way that you were empowered in the first place was by stripping away countries from these resources. You also then institutionalize this sort of shame within these individual countries. When you've got huge empires and huge cultural structures that already existed in Southeast Asia, like you already see with the Angkor Wats and you see the Borobudur and so on. These were already existent structures that when we stripped away in colonization were already seen to be primitive and backwards. Not only that, they then took all of these resources back into their homeland, ladies and gentlemen, and we tell you that in restoring this, you get to restore some form of pride, the same sort of pride that was stripped away long ago, and you re-engineer the way that society feels within this circumstance. There are sentimentalities to this, you're out of order, but we tell you that returning this returns a proof of a former glory that has long been forgotten, something that we need to exist. Why does colonial guilt need to be changed? In this circumstance, we told you there's already a change in the moral compass, the way that society feels it, especially in countries like the UK, where dominance is already deemed to be legitimate. Things like slavery, despite the fact that it was never made law in the past, slavery is something that's still retrospectively condemned and still retrospectively receive the sort of punishment that already exists. We also tell you there's hypocrisy because you talk about slavery, so you talk about this how it's illegitimate in the past, but then you have monuments that celebrate the colonization that already exists. It is something today that should not be graciously accepted because it's not done altruistically, but it's done because of the past harms. With that, thank you.
Hello.